Welcome to Todd Nief's show, where I have some conversations with interesting people and attempt to work through complicated, complex, difficult topics and learn out loud for, honestly, mostly my benefit, but also hopefully yours as well. And in today's podcast, we have John Nerst as a guest. John is the author of the excellent blog called Everything Studies. John works as a data analyst in Sweden, and he also has a tendency to gather a lot of information on a lot of different topics and attempt to work through it in his blog, which is excellent, as I share his tendency to be interested in so much stuff that it feels almost bad and overwhelming, which we talk about a little bit in this podcast. But John has a lot of really interesting posts, and we'll link to some of them in the show notes. So I'd recommend subscribing to his blog, following that if you enjoy this conversation at all. But I reached out to John because I wanted to talk about his post from a few years back on the tilted political compass, as well as some of his work on nerdiness and identity, which I think are pretty salient topics today. And honestly, we, as is often the case, I write down dozens of questions and we only get to a handful of them. But in this conversation, we spend a lot of time talking about philosophy and how people contextualize information, and then potential political realignments along different axes than the standard left-right from political days of yore. So if that sounds interesting to you, listen on. And again, if you enjoy this, highly recommend following John's blog, Everything Studies. So John, you study everything and blog about it in a way that is, I think, relatable to a lot of folks who spend time on the internet, where it's like, oh, there's this completely crushing amount of stuff out there to potentially be interested in. And some of us, which I think you may relate to this, feel just like a crushing anxiety and borderline depression about how much cool stuff there is to know and how little of it that we will actually know over time. Do you relate to this this sense of urgency related to knowledge?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm a little surprised you started with that, because I wasn't quite ready for it. You went straight down into the dark depths of my soul here.
Go deep.
Yeah. No, I've been thinking about that. There's so many things you'd like to spend an entire life learning about, and then develop further and create things in or with. And yeah, I don't know how to deal with that exactly. And if you had a solution to it, I'm sure you would have told somebody by now. But I just try to filter really hard, I guess. I mean, when I'm buying a new book, I try to read reviews and read what other people have said about it, so I know whether it's going to add anything to my mental map, so to speak. Because you could read things about your favorite topic for the rest of your life, but I did that when I was younger. I just read things that I liked, and that told me things I already knew and things I already thought was true. But I've tried to change that lately and read things that are, just the right amount away from my comfort zone.
And what was your favorite topic?
I've changed favorite topics so many times during life. It's been astronomy and physics when I was younger, and then philosophy of mind and language and geography and history and psychology and all of these things. And lately, I guess I've been more interested in things I neglected before. I've written a few things about postmodernism and social constructionism and those kinds of schools of thought. And it's been interesting to me to try to find out what is insightful and valuable to me as a staunch scientific materialist. What is interesting in those schools of thought for me. And that was really difficult, because I noticed that almost nothing in that space is written with my background and temperament in mind. And therefore, when you read it, it's really, really difficult to understand what it means, because every other sentence there's something like, no, wait, what is that, what does that mean? No, that doesn't follow from that. Wait, why are you talking about this? And you need that explicated for, to be suited perfectly to yourself in order to really understand what somebody is trying to say. Because there's always so much there's a lot of unspoken background knowledge that you need to understand, but there are also a lot of certain preoccupations that people have that they don't tend to be forthright about. Or I wouldn't say forthright, but they don't tend to be outspoken about them. They don't tend to think that they need to be stated because it feels really obvious. And that's not just other people. Everybody's like that. So am I. And it's when we try to understand somebody that have ideas that are quite different from our own, we need to understand that they have their eyes fixed on something else that we don't see. And it's usually quite hard for us to understand what it is. And you really need to try to figure that out, like you're a detective. Like,
Sure.
why is this person concerned with this thing? Can we use that clue over there, like 6 pages ago, and try to figure out why do they think that A implies B? Do they tie these things together and think that those two are separate? And it's fascinating in a way, but it can also be really frustrating to try to figure out why. Yeah, to try to reconstruct an image of what another person thinks in your own head.
Yeah, that there's for you, you've written a lot about disagreements online, and I think the impulse for a lot of people experiencing what you might be experiencing, reading something that doesn't make sense to you, or that you don't agree with, or that you see that the arguments kind of don't follow in the way that the person writing it, thinks that they should, at least in your head. The initial impulse is to either disregard that or argue against it, or say something contemptuous about it on Twitter or whatever. But it sounds like you take a different approach. You try to figure out, okay, if I were to interpret this as charitably as possible, how would this make sense? Or like, what context am I missing? Is that an accurate way that you approach that type of thing?
Yeah, I try to do that. I mean, I have these irritated emotional reactions to things as well, just like everybody else. But I also find that things often make at least a little bit more sense than they sound. If you think if you think this is just nonsense about something that somebody says, then you probably don't quite understand what they mean, or what a certain word is supposed to mean, or against what it is supposed to be contrasting, or what values influence somebody to think that a certain thing is desirable, or that a certain thing is important, or something like that. Now, I mean, of course, there are exceptions. There, people who think the world's flat. Maybe they're just confused. And I know that there are many cases in which people are just wrong about things. And I used to be much more the kind of person who thought that, well, there are true things, that people who know things, they know the true things, and then there are people who are just ignorant or confused. But I think at this point in my life, I have isolated a lot of the stupid stuff from my entire experience of reality, and I'm more interested in finding the nuances between things that are not quite right and not quite wrong. Things that aren't
Which is
plain
most
facts.
things, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are simple facts, but they're not that interesting, and people's disagreements about them are not that interesting. And there are fundamental value differences as well, and they can be a little bit more interesting, but often they're not simple, like I prefer A and you prefer B, and when A and B are in contrast, we will disagree about things. That's also quite uncomplicated. But the really complicated things comes when we don't have one of those situations, but rather we disagree on how to represent reality. And I think something that most of us aren't thinking enough about is the difference between the world as it is, like physically, and the conceptual models we use to represent it. What does a word mean exactly? Or how do different ideas relate to each other? And that is less reflective of the real world. I mean, the relationship between those models and the real world is a lot more complicated than we feel they are in most cases.
And that actually sounds to me like that some of the postmodern stuff that maybe rubs you the wrong way is actually, maybe rubbing off on you a little bit.
No, they're right about that. They're absolutely right about that. I had to read some of those thoughts phrased differently in order to appreciate that. And there are, I mean, many of those things are true, and I try to say that as well. We need to take you need to take into account at least some of these ideas. Now, when people take them too far, or abuse them, or get really aggressive with them, or simplify things in such extreme ways that what they start to say things that are absurd on the face of it, then you take things too far. But there is something. There are important insights here, and now my historical knowledge about this isn't that great, but in the past, before modernity, philosophers used to think that words or concepts were sort of directly the direct constituent parts of reality as it is. That there really were such a thing as justice or beauty or rightness and goodness and things like that. And in the modern world, we got away from that and started to think of the world as a physical place. And then in the postmodern world, we let's see where I'm going with this. That bedrock of the physical world started to get questioned as well. So I don't necessarily think that the modern worldview and the postmodern worldview are all that different. I prefer to keep the physical world as something that is relatively untouched by the big revolutions of the postmodern era. It's mostly high level abstractions that are not really true or false in a strict sense. But as you get down to the nuts and bolts of physical reality, the interpretive flexibility of sentences and claims, they shrink to almost negligible proportions.
Sure.
And more high level stuff, that is where you can't even say that something is necessarily true or not, because if you're going to translate it into something concrete, it's going to change into something different, basically.
Yeah, totally. That there's I mean, I think that this probably happened for me at some point in high school where, you sort of have that moment of like, oh, does everyone see the same color red that I see? Right. And you sort of have that moment of like, wow, what does that even mean? And then you're like, does everyone mean the same thing when they say the as I mean when I say the? And you're like, nothing is real. This is crazy. Like, what is even happening? Right. And
I'm not sure that the is the best example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. But just like, that do words map onto the same concepts at all in someone else's brain? And that, that's like a mind-blowing moment for a lot of people the first time you think about something like that. But then it's almost like, trivially mind-blowing. And you're like, okay, well, if I'm going to exist in the world, I have to at least make some baseline assumptions to continue to exist in the world. And, questioning every possible interpretation of everything at every time is not really a useful way to move forward.
No, and I think interacting with the physical world together, interacting with the same physical world, makes it possible for us to understand each other to a certain extent, because we share that experience. It is when we get further away from everyday experience and more into the territory of abstractions that we can disagree dramatically about things with in a way that we have a difficulty understanding. I mean, I can go into a store and buy, I don't know, a piece of candy from somebody who believes completely different things about the nature of reality than I do. But we both understand that, okay, give me the piece of candy and I'll give you a little, some money for it. and will say hi and bye and thanks, and I'll go. While I believe that the universe is made of atoms in motion, and morality is some sort of conceptual structure that we have put on top of our evolved social instincts, quote unquote, to make our societies work, while that person might believe that the world is created by a divine creator who handed down the truth and goodness through personal revelations to a few select people. And those ideas, those really abstracted ideas that are far from the practicalities of everyday life, they couldn't be different. And there are other versions than those two, of course, but because we're interacting in the concrete world, we don't see how big those differences are, and that's so fascinating to me. It's like if we go out on the street, you see a bunch of cars, and they look pretty much alike. I mean, okay, there are different colors and a few different designs, but they look pretty much alike. I can imagine that what if these cars were completely different inside? One car might be it might be made like a regular car. It has metal parts and tubes and wires and everything. And then there's just this other car who is made out of tiny little people who are pulling levers and strings and that. And then there's the third car who's made out of taped together marshmallows. But for some reason, they come out working in exactly the same way when you experience them. And it seems to me that people are a little bit like that. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, that there's an interesting dynamic where, you mentioned our sort of like evolved social structure, right? And I'm obviously probably more empathetic with your worldview and your explanation there. And my perspective on it is that a lot of that stuff is similar to maybe like universal grammar, right? Where we have this evolved social structure and like certain personality tendencies that are kind of built in. And then that there's like a shocking amount of stuff that can be sort of shoved into those templates, right? Similar to language, where it's like, okay, every language shares a few key aspects of how people communicate and how, verbs exist. And, certainly I'd have to brush up on some Chomsky to lay out the actual outline of universal grammar, but the actual variation in the ways that people speak is unbelievable, even though it's built on this innate structure. And I think that humans have probably a similar capacity in most things, right? As far as like worldview, explanations, personality, tendency in terms of how to filter information, but just the variance between individuals is shocking.
Yeah, sometimes you just understand that somebody sees the world on like an emotional or cognitive level very differently from you, and that can be it can just be very interesting to understand. Wow, okay, I see now how that must be. Yes, that must be very, very different than my experience. And the difficulty then is to not just take that as an interesting tidbit and just throw it away when you go about the rest of your life, because you need to remember these things in trying to understand how other people work, that they might have just very different outlook than you do. And often when there are practicalities involved and you have shared goals, like at a workplace, maybe it doesn't come out so much, because you can focus on the work and you can focus on the specific details. But when you're talking about abstract things, like, well, particularly when you're talking about philosophy, it gets so messy, because there's no good way to communicate abstractions that are built on abstractions that are built on abstractions. There's nothing to hold on to make sure that you're on the same page, whatever something means. And politics can be about concrete issues as well, but when people have really elaborate political worldviews or elaborate political views, there tends to be a lot of philosophy in that as well. So those complexities come out if people talk about justice or fairness or whatever it means. Those are just there are words that just cause a lot of trouble when it comes to understanding each other.
And do you have an
Because they're so
example?
abstract.
Yeah. Do you have an example of something that you've seen, right, that you disagreed with, that you've sort of gone through this process of like, okay, I need to figure out what context this person is coming to this issue from, what assumptions they're making, how they view something like justice or fairness or whatever that may be different from mine, that you were able to sort of parse and figure out, oh, what's actually going on here, and come to a better understanding of their worldview?
Well, it was what I talked about before with postmodernists and social constructivists. But there was one particular sentence I thought about when you said this, that somebody was like retweeting it into my timeline, and a lot of people were saying that this is completely insane, this is completely nonsensical. Somebody says, and it was somebody who said this, like, if you're white and want the best for your children, you are contributing to white supremacy. Like, and people were saying this is completely insane. And my spontaneous reaction is, okay, like that sounds a little unhinged to me. But I can also understand that if you mean certain things with the phrase white supremacy, and if you have a certain view of society and you think in terms of groups rather than individuals, you think in terms of informal power and structural advantage instead of laws and rules, which other schools of thought would focus on. It is not insane. I mean, you can choose to see things that way, and that could be considered extreme, but it is not nonsense. Given a certain amount of background assumptions, and you take your, you have your argument, if A then B, if B then C, then you get to that conclusion. It is not nonsense. And it's the same process, I guess, I had when I wrote a long time ago, I wrote an article about what it means to say that there's a war on Christmas going on. And some people said, people don't actually believe this, it's just a lie. And then I thought, well, you have to think what a war on something actually means. I mean, it's rhetorical hyperbole, but you can interpret it in a way that makes sense. And I think that's when I wrote something I've been referring back to a few times, that if you sense that something somebody says is part of a like rival political narrative, something is part of a group or a political faction that you don't like, and they say something that is somewhat open to interpretation. And as I've said before, everything that is vaguely abstract is open to interpretation. And especially on Twitter, when you have like one or two lines to write, everything is open to interpretation. And we will probably, and half consciously or half unconsciously, we will believe that if this person who says this is like an enemy of us, we will interpret what they say to be something that isn't true, or something that is completely insane. While if it's somebody that we perceive to be on our side, we will interpret whatever they say to be something that is true, or something that is reasonable. And often you can, often there's a remarkable amount of flexibility in what people say means.
Yeah, and people will also say things, sort of like you mentioned with some of those tweets, right? They'll say things as a group identifier, right? They'll say things to sort of whatever trumpet which tribe they belong to and whatever disagreement is happening. And the fact that assumption exists in the overall discourse does make it very difficult to give someone the benefit of the doubt, or to try to interpret what they're saying charitably, especially if they say something that kind of triggers that like outgroup political flag for you, right? So the white supremacy tweet that you mentioned, I think it's like a multi-layer contextualization, right? Where someone is saying, if you just want the best for our kids, they're latching onto this thing that people say when they pull their, white children out of ethnically diverse schools and create like massive segregation in the American school system, which is like a large systemic problem that, some people would refer to as white supremacy, right? And I imagine that's like the context that you're referring to when you're like, okay, if you would interpret it this way, it kind of makes sense. But if you interpret it literally, like trying to, do a good job for your kids as being a bad thing, then that's like that doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah, I didn't actually see the actual context for the tweet. I was just thinking when people were reacting and saying it was ridiculous, I was just thinking, well, I can see how you can say this from a certain point of view. But there's also like, the ideas that we typically regard to be either true or reasonable, they are often inconsistent. I mean, we will accept one thing as true or reasonable, and like this is an okay idea, and then this other idea over here, we might also accept it as an okay idea. But if we use them to make further conclusions, they might, they might collide at some point. And therefore, you might have this bag of ideas that you believe, and you can put them together and build on them further, and you will get somewhere that is a little extreme, and you might not actually believe that. That is how I interpret that tweet. I mean, you can have a few basic ideas that you believe, and that will lead to the conclusion that she said in that tweet. But most people who accept the underlying ideas might not accept that conclusion. So I think there's a problem sometimes that we will treat language and ideas like they're logical symbols, and that if you have a few ideas, you can use them to construct other ideas, and like it's mathematical logic. And therefore, if these ideas are true, then all the things we can use them to go from here to another place. That place will be valid too, and that just doesn't work because concepts and words are not logical symbols. This is one of those cases where I will go, am I making any sense? Because I didn't plan this out.
No, totally. Yeah. So, I mean, essentially what you're saying, right, is that people think of argumentation. Well, I don't know if they actually think of it this way, but if people think of argumentation the same way that you would think of whatever, like a mathematical proof, where it's like, okay, here's line 1, and then here's line 2, and then here's this other equation that I'm introducing that was proved elsewhere, and then we can, substitute the variables from line 1 and line 2 into our new equation. Therefore, we have line 4, QED, thus it is proven, right? That you can just sort of have this like impenetrable sequence of symbols that results in a new conclusion being formed. But, when people try to do that, like you're saying, with words, especially words that are pointing to abstractions like truth, justice, fairness, etc., that you don't have this like line 3 necessarily follows from line 4 that you do in a mathematical proof, but people sort of think that it does, at least for the arguments that they like. So they flip out when someone doesn't agree with them because they have a different definition or a different context for the words that someone is using in their argument. Is that a reasonable summary of what you were saying?
Yeah. I think there are two things. Sometimes people use this kind of argumentation to try to establish a certain conclusion, and that is surprisingly ineffective. I don't think anybody really is convinced by anything like that, because these abstractions that you use in order to create these chains of argument, they leak all the time. And some of these chains of arguments, they're worse than others because they involve tweaking the definition of a word at each step. But also that if you have a wide range of ideas that you believe, and you can combine them, you can usually combine them in different ways to create other ideas, and some of them you might support, and others among them you might not support. So it's not really. I lost my train of thought now, but yeah, some of them. Basically, if you like the conclusion, you'll build that structure to get there. But if you don't like other conclusions you could draw, you're not going to be building that structure. So people you can just avoid, well, what you believe here, A and B, together they form C, but you don't believe that. Oh no, I don't really believe that. So we really shouldn't be doing this quasi logic with ordinary words, because that's just not how argumentation works. It's a kind of an artifice that we have created, that arguments should work this way, like with logical certainty. But in order to get that to work, we have to nail down and formalize our beliefs in such an extreme way that they don't really look like our beliefs anymore.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean? Yeah.
That essentially, you have an emotional reaction to whatever the conclusion is, and you decide you either like it or don't. And then, like you said, you either build the argument backwards from the conclusion, or if there's a conclusion that someone else has that you don't like, and they, show their work, so to speak, and have an argument, you can easily be like, well, yeah, I don't actually agree with that point. I don't think that the way that you, define justice or fairness in this point is correct. And interestingly, I think even, people who are engaged in more like hard science or whatever will do a similar thing, right? That you potentially have some sort of insight or intuition that an idea is correct, right? You're like, oh, what if this is the way that this actually works, right? What if, this equation results in, I don't know, like unified field theory or something. You're like, oh, that seems like it might actually work. You have like an inkling of an idea or some sort of connection, and then you attempt to create an experiment to figure out if it's true or not, or you attempt to, piece together the mathematical proof to solve it, right? Or if you're writing code, you have some sort of idea of like, oh, like that might be a way to work around this like weird problem that's occurring, and then you try to figure out if you can make the functions actually do it. And it does seem to be almost the default mode by which humans do anything, is like a burst of intuition and emotion, and then try to fill in the gaps that got you there.
Yeah. That science actually works like that a lot of the time. It's one of the big central insights of the sociology of scientific knowledge, or the school that's called the social construction of scientific knowledge, that they discuss a lot that what hypotheses get explored and what counts as evidence for those hypotheses. It's not given by nature. It is dependent on social processes, what people think are serious hypotheses and what they're interested in, and so forth. That has some relevance. I think it is not super relevant to the hard sciences, because those models are really, really tightly coupled to reality. But when you get to social sciences and psychology and things like that, you understand how, it has such an enormous impact on the state of science, specifically in the social sciences, because what sort of explanations people are looking for and what sort of problems they are interested in affects the content of those sciences so much. And using like physics as a typical example is a little strange to me. I wrote about this in an article a couple of years ago called Science, the Constructionists and Reality, that I commented that applying this model of like the social construction of knowledge onto hard science is so strange, because it is the example that is the furthest away, where it is the least relevant. It's a little bit relevant, but it's the least relevant, and it is very, very relevant to softer fields.
Yeah. And well, even with physics, one could probably make some similar arguments about, the way that tenure works at certain facilities or whatever potentially pushes people to research certain types of problems, that, Eric Weinstein, whatever you think of him as, criticized string theory heavily, right? As sort of like the entire physics community is sort of trapped in this dead end mathematical noodling. And, I certainly don't know enough about it to evaluate the claim, but, he's sort of making almost a similar type of argument, albeit from someone who's more well-versed within the actual mechanics of the field, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that type of, not even necessarily social constructivist criticism, but sort of criticizing people's motives or how they find things, you can make that type of criticism from an outside view where you're sort of like, this entire institution is bullshit and is corrupt and like, here's why. Or when you're on the inside and you actually see the machinations of how like the sausage gets made, so to speak, oftentimes you're like, wait, this is supposed to be about like pure scientific truth and inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality. And like, you idiots are all just like chasing funding and trying to increase your social status. I hate this.
Yeah, I mean, they're pointing to the same issues, I think, but they have slightly different things, different problems they want to focus on. I mean, the constructivists that constructivists, that's a combination of constructionists and constructivists. And I'm trying to remember the difference, but I can't right now. But the text that I read from them, they were very much inspired by Foucault, and who was writing in the 60s, and the status of science was quite different than today. So they were mostly concerned of how things that were supposedly, knowledge that is supposedly scientific was used, as social currency to project power in society. And I think somebody like Weinstein is probably concerned about other things, probably about the quality of science. But it's interesting that you brought up string theory, because it is also quite far away from like the nitty-gritty of reality. I mean, in one way, it's very, very physical, in that it refers to physics, but it's also far away from practicalities. It is so abstract. My favorite example of sciencey science that's reliable is something like chemistry, and like the nature of matter and how different molecules fit together, and how we can explain how water boils and ice melts and wood burns and all that. That particular aspect, how does everyday matter that we come into contact with, how does it work, and why does it behave the way it does, is such a massive success story for science that I consider it like the best, the science that is the most reliable, because it is more or less, at least some of the big central problems there seem to be solved, and we have gained an understanding of how matter works practically.
Yeah, and I think that there's also like we've been talking a lot about different contexts, right? It's what are you trying to correct for, which I believe you've written about and talked about before too, right? That if we use the example of whatever political wheeling and dealing within academic departments, that's something that's going to happen, independent of the overall quality of the science. Maybe not independent, but it's going to happen pretty much no matter what. And, if you have someone who doesn't recognize that that's going on, or thinks that all the results that come out of a certain department or a certain discipline or whatever, like, should be fully trusted, and that, that the academic institution is doing the best job possible no matter what, that person may need to have someone who's been through the ringer, so to speak, be like, listen, here's how funding works. Here's why this person got this tenure track position. Here's why this journal publishes these kinds of papers. Here's why this paper got shelved, even though it, had some conclusion that would potentially be valuable. Here's how this person fiddled with their data. That if you're correcting for sort of like a naive view of how things work, that might be valuable, right? But it may be inappropriate if you're speaking to someone who doesn't even recognize the value of science, or the fact that, we have solved hard problems and figured out how wood burns and utilize that to, endless prosperity across the globe, et cetera. Right.
Yeah. This thing about correcting for something can easily cause a lot of confusion, which I've read about, written about before. And you might be referring to some of that. specifically all this criticism of science, it came about during a time when science had such an exalted status, and it needed to be brought down a peg. Maybe not science, but in the middle of the 20th century, we wanted to do everything and anything in this rationalistic, very scientific manner, and a lot of those efforts just didn't pan out very well. And I can understand in that cultural environment, you needed to criticize, science and the scientific mindset of being not all that it was cracked up to be. But it's been decades since then, and the cultural environment isn't the same. But if you give people those same criticisms today, when they're not living in that cultural environment, it's going to be interpreted differently. It's going to be interpreted as, oh well, science is all corrupt. We can't know anything, and blah blah blah. So I think it's a big
and buy my essential oils, right? Like that's the way it's often deployed now, right? It's like it's all corrupt. We can't know anything. I have these essential oils for sale. Like you need to join my my pod and my team.
Could be that. Yeah, but I would think that's a very, very general problem. I think you should try to remember at all times that everybody is responding to something. There's this joke format that's popular on Twitter where it just says nobody, and then there's nothing. And then some person says something that's supposed to reveal that they are obsessed with some certain some topic that nobody else is talking about. And it's supposed to satirize this kind of personality that's always going on and on about their little pet issue, and I think that is often quite. I mean, that's a misunderstanding. Often, I think few people believe themselves to be that person who goes on about something that isn't relevant, because everybody has they are responding to something. If you say something and to other people it is not obvious why you would think why this is important to say, then that person probably has some idea of why it is important. They probably think that it is typically denied. People think differently about this, or it is important for some other reason. I don't have any great examples right now. I'm bad with examples. But
a man of abstraction.
Yeah. No, I remember I wrote this. It was also a controversial tweet. Tweets tend to be thought-provoking. It was earlier this year where Richard Dawkins got into quite some trouble for writing that. He said something. It's weird to say that eugenics on human wouldn't work. Of course it would work. It works on other species, blah, blah, blah. And people got really angry and saying, how dare you support, eugenics? And he got really angry about that and said, I didn't say anything about that. I just said it would work. And there, in that whole context around that fight, I saw people making that thing like, why would he even say that if he didn't mean anything by it? And I don't think that he said it because he wanted something to be done. I think he said it because he had seen somewhere people denying that it would work and say, no, we shouldn't do this, not just because it's evil and bad, but because it wouldn't work. And that probably irritated him as a biologist and said, no, it would actually work. Not that we do it, but it would actually work. And so I assumed that there was something in the background that he had read somewhere or read many times before and was triggered by something he read. But you never see that particular context when somebody says something controversial and everybody going, why are you saying this? It's usually something that set it off, I think.
Yeah, and it just gets dumped right into other people's contexts, and they're like, weird guy suddenly talking about eugenics. What are you doing, man?
Why are you saying this for no reason?
Yeah. So you kind of danced around this idea of contextualization of information in a bunch of disagreement, et cetera. And you've written a bunch about people who tend to be really good contextualizers versus people who tend to be decouplers, right? Sort of like we're kind of like we're doing about contextualization, for example. People who are sort of better at, taking things on a like all things being equal basis. So do you mind giving just like a brief explanation of this idea of like a contextualizing versus decoupling axis?
Oh dear, yeah, we're getting to this now. Oh.
Brief explanation.
This is just
just 30 seconds, please.
This is just such a mess. I first introduced this concept in a really long post at the very end, and it was about this sort of hot button political topic. And I brought it in at the end because I've been thinking about this thing for so long, and I was, here's something that is vaguely relevant to. I'll just put it out here, and people got really excited about this concept, and it got more popular than I thought it would. So it took like maybe 2 weeks for me to write another article saying that no, it really is a lot more complicated than this. And I actually I have another work in progress to discuss all the different kinds of decoupling, because I think there is a certain like psychological dimension between people who want to look at a thing in isolation. Well, there are two things: in isolation from other things, and in isolation from the real world. You can isolate in two directions. You can isolate ideas from each other, and you can isolate ideas from the real world. And I treated those as one thing, but they're really two things. But there are people who like to deal with very circumscribed, small, formal problems, like mathematicians or computer programmers. And there are people who like things to be very much in the real world, with lots of associations and connotations and experiences, and also maybe think that associations between ideas are important, and they exist whether you think of it or not, and you can't just separate things from each other and deal with it in the abstract. You need to see how things work in the real world. But as I said, introducing this idea in the context of like a hot button political issue I don't think it was the best idea, because in such, in that context, there are other things than like temperament, whether you like to abstract and decontextualize, or whether you like to contextualize things. There are other concerns that are more important for what you do than your personal temperament. So it probably wasn't the best place to introduce it. So I'm still struggling with how to define this. But in one place, I said that the core part of like decoupling in an argument with somebody is to say that ideas are not linked unless both agree that they are. And the coupler, or whatever you'd say, perspective is that if I can make a link between two ideas, by history or symbolism or structural similarity or causation or logic or whatever, then that is valid. That counts, even if the other person doesn't think they do. That's something I boiled it down to in an argument. But there's also simply the difference of whether scientific questions should be considered to be like formal issues that are separate from the real world, and the answers should be you should say whatever the method you're employing, whatever results it gives, you should just you just publish that and talk about it, or whether it is important to also think of the social context in which people will receive that information. As you can hear, this is just getting more complicated and muddy the more I think about it. But
sounds like a good topic for an article. Then. Yeah, you got to work it out.
Yeah, I'm working on it. But on the most general level, it is just really are things separate and abstracted little formal problems, or is everything connected to everything, and everything is in the world, and you can't separate stuff from each other?
Yeah, and I think that it sounds like it surprised you that resonated with people so much, which is kind of interesting, right? Because I imagine that a lot of the people who read your blog or adjacent blogs, or who even came across the post that you're talking about, which was the Sam Harris Ezra Klein post, correct?
Yeah.
Right, just digging into the, people can actually go back and read that post because it's great, and the associated argumentative podcasts and blog posts between Sam Harris and Ezra Klein, which aren't so great and are kind of frustrating, especially if you're a fan of both of them.
They're interesting.
We're like, what are you guys doing? Yeah,
they're interesting if you like train wrecks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's almost not surprising to me at all that was so resonant with people, because I think a lot of the folks who do read a blog like yours or pay attention to that type of academic content probably tend more toward the decouplers, right? Meaning that they enjoy making little thought experiments and being like, well, holding all things equal, like what if we do this thing? Or maybe, dialing something to the absolute extreme, like can we morally justify this type of thing if we make it as extreme as possible? Those types of things that when you do that in normal conversation with people, sort of like Richard Dawkins, they get mad at you. They're like, why are you doing that? That's an insane thing to say, or they end up with constant arguments with their romantic partners because they're thinking about some abstract idea and trying to completely pick it apart and like hammer down the weak parts of the arguments and, figure out where the disagreement is. And then their romantic partner is like, you're hurting my feelings. Please stop doing this. Right. And then they find people online that are talking about, they're like, oh, that makes so much sense to me. Like I do this and it causes problems in normal life, but in this online world, I can actually think this way.
You just brought in the quote unquote, the coolly rational versus emotional dimension as well, which I've thought like, oh, that is not the same thing exactly, but all these things they're vaguely relevant to each other. So it's really hard for me to, ironically, it's hard for me to decouple decoupling from what it isn't. But I think part of the reason that it bothered me a little bit is that I was not entirely satisfied with that myself. I mean, it was at the end of the article, and it was an afterthought, because my big conclusion about what this argument or what this fight was really about is actually the section just before that. And then the other thing was just something I thought up this thing. This is an interesting, like, coda. And then people really got into that, and this is maybe the other thing I was a little concerned about. People started using it as a badge of honor, like I'm a high decoupler. I'm good because of that. And then a few other people were using it to mock people and saying that like it was sociopathic or like, what's the word I'm looking for? You were completely blind to the consequences of things, and morally deficient or whatever. So it became something that people would use as a weapon, kind of, and fight over. And I don't really like my stuff being used for that. So that's part of the reason why I'm trying to this is really complicated, you guys.
That's excellent. It's like Malcolm Gladwell in the 10,000 Hours, right? Where he kind of had that as like a little idea tucked into a passage in the book Outliers, where he took some research and didn't do a super thorough job of understanding it or explaining it, and then it became this thing that people latched onto. And he was like, wait a second, this isn't really the right way to interpret this, and you guys are kind of doing it wrong. And I actually think that he had some dialogues with Anders Ericsson, who did some of that original research, just explaining like, hey, this is the way you guys are doing this is wrong, like don't do it this way. But it's sort of like, to bring Dawkins back in, right? It's like it's a mimetic chunk of information that kind of latches onto a certain aspect of people's brains, and they're like, all right, here's this axis upon which I can ridicule people on Twitter. Let me get in there.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, it's a really some things are really mimetically fit, as you might say. Specifically, things like the 10,000 hour rule. I think whoever did that research, was it Ericsson? You said, who did the research in the beginning?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure he's entirely happy with how it was overblown either.
No, not at all.
And it reminds me of things like the wisdom of the crowds, that concept.
Mm-hmm.
I read that book a few years ago, and the whole book is like, there are these really far-reaching requirements that need to be fulfilled in order for the wisdom of the crowds to be a thing and actually work the way it's supposed to. And here are 10 things that might go wrong. But of course, none of that, like when the idea escaped from the book, none of that was there. It was like, oh well, the wisdom of the crowd's right. People like this the most, so it's the best because wisdom of the crowds and all that. And it must be super frustrating as a writer when that happens. And I had totally. Maybe a little taste of it with this.
Yeah, and self-plug for anyone listening, recent episode with Albert Cow is actually on the wisdom of the crowds and some of that stuff, right? That he does research, so the original wisdom of the crowds research was based on the Condorcet jury theorem, which, like you mentioned, has a bunch of specific requirements, right? That, as you add more minds to solving a problem or making an estimation, there's a bunch of the information needs to be uncorrelated, and the probability of someone being accurate needs to be greater than 50%. And there may be one or two other assumptions, right? And Albert Cow's research is on actually relaxing those assumptions, right? What if the information is correlated? What if people aren't more likely than not to be correct? And what kind of situations do you get? And he actually has a really interesting finding, which is that the wisdom of the crowds is not correct in a lot of those situations. In a lot of complex environments, the best situation is like small modular groups, making their own decisions and then sort of like aggregating their information up, right? Because that sort of prevents bad information from just washing through the system and making everyone incorrect, which is fascinating. And I think, you hesitate to jump from toy problems to 2020 media landscape, but you're like, oh, I kind of see how this might be relevant.
Yeah, it really is. Well, yeah, about decoupling, there's just one thing I want to mention there, because I just read it before this conversation. There is this great blog post by a blog called Dross Bucket that's called the Cognitive Decoupling Elite, which is where I...
Can you spell that blog real quick?
DROSSBUCKET.
Cool.
And it's called the Cognitive Decoupling Elite, and it was the article I read just before I wrote the thing on my own blog, and it's very interesting because it's written by Lucy Keir, a mathematician, but she doesn't really like decoupling. She doesn't enjoy like the way it feels to do it, but she's a mathematician anyway, and describes how she feels about it, and quotes like some Sylvia Plath about how it felt to do physics compared to like botany. And I really liked that post because it made me understand what it feels like to be really I wouldn't say grossed out, that's not the right word, but sort of feel bad about the sort of formalistic abstractions of physics and the sort of mindless interacting of symbols in formal systems. To me, I would find that elegant rather than like sterile and hostile and terrible. But it was interesting to me to read an account of what it feels like to feel differently. That's always a great experience to understand how it looks like from another vantage point, something that you don't share, and actually feeling you understand it. So I recommend that one. And that is it's important to know that is a different kind of decoupling than, say, you know, the thing you do around like hot button political topics, because this has almost nothing to do with that. This is more about liking the cleanness of abstractions versus the vividness of sensory experience. They are related in a way, but they're not really the same thing. I mean, nothing is the same thing, but again, it it shows a little bit how different definitions of decoupling can be, because that is about abstraction.
Yeah, and so you're working on another decoupling post, and it sounds like are you really trying to just parse out all these different ways of decoupling? Is that kind of the overall theory?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to, you know, have a list of different ways that it feels like the things that feel like decoupling, but are very different, because I've become really sort of enamored with Wittgenstein's idea of how concepts work. Traditionally, you have definitions, and like these are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a member of a category. Like it has to be this and this and this. But in reality, he said, concepts don't really work like that. They work more on something like family resemblance. You have this group of people, and you see that they're similar to each other in some ways, but there's not one or a set of features that they all share. And I think it helps a lot to see almost all abstract concepts that way. And decoupling is very much like that. You can you have different ways and different meanings, and they relate to each other. But if you follow a few links in that structure, you can have two things that are almost completely separate. But there are other definitions like in between.
Yeah, it's almost like genres of music, right? That's maybe like a salient way of thinking of it for people. You know, if you think about whatever Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden and some sort of Suffocation, like a relatively brutal death metal band, it's like, okay, like those bands don't actually sound anything like each other.
Yeah, but you could take like Elvis and death metal, and you can go step by step from one to the other.
And you don't even have to take that many jumps. It's like a pretty straightforward. You can be like, hey, like this is, you listen to this record, then you listen to this one, and you listen to this one, and each of them share something. But by the time you get to the other side of it, you're like, this is completely different.
Yeah, and that means that when you create concepts, you slice out like a particular little part of the world, and it is quite. It has a certain amount of subjectivity to what you want to group together in a concept. And that's something I wish people would keep in mind more. Like a lot of things are just subjective. Like, where do you want to draw the line? Are these things the same thing, or are they different things? Well, people would disagree about that. And quite often people won't really think it's legitimate to have different views on what things are the same and what things are different.
Yeah, or they're just whatever, matching them on a totally different axis than someone else.
Yeah, because I'm a realist when it comes to the actual world, like the physical world. Yeah, it's real and all that, and there are patterns and regularities that are real. But when we conceptualize things, there are so many, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but at least somewhat subjective choices we make in order to form concepts and how these concepts relate to each other. That I'm going back to what I said in the beginning here, but as soon as you go one or two levels of abstraction, there's a lot of subjectivity involved, and there's a lot of humility to be had.
Yeah, a lot of degrees of freedom to make or break an argument. So we've been talking about this coupling or contextualizing and decoupling axis. And actually, one of the reasons I reached out to you initially about podcasting was this Tilted Political Compass article, which most of the questions I even sent you beforehand were about that. We haven't even talked about that at all. But I figured that might actually be relevant to jump into that a little bit, especially because I think that was a post for you that also maybe garnered a bit more attention than you expected, and you were sort of like, oh wait, hold on, like these ideas aren't fully fleshed out, but you guys like it, so I don't know. But yeah, I mean, you sort of take the traditional left-right axis and then add this coupling slash decoupling axis on the other side, right? And that seems to, at least offer some insight in terms of categorizing people's political beliefs. So do you mind giving a brief explanation of how people can potentially think about, contextualizing versus decoupling as far as their place, their political home, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually something. It's a thought I had even from the beginning when I wrote that first article, that you can transfer this quite cleanly to the political realm, like coupling and decoupling, because the decoupled thing is that they're abstract and they relate to other ideas only through formal mechanisms. Like there's a rule that means you can connect this idea to this idea and so forth. There are like strict formal processes between ideas, and they are not linked to anything else by default. And then there's the other one where every idea has these ineffable associative links to all other ideas, like by default, and that you could transfer this into ideas about how you think about people. On the first side there, the coupled side, then people would by default be just disconnected from each other and have no particular relationship by default, or no particular obligations or anything, and they would interact through formal mechanisms like currency or contracts or voluntary agreements. And this is like the libertarian political like perspective, basically. And on the other side, the far at the other end, you would have, I don't know, like a commune or something would work. Like everything belongs to everybody. You have these undefined but potentially arbitrarily large duties and obligations to other people, and you're supposed to, well, love your neighbor like yourself, basically, and by default, be connected to the whole of the collective, and other people and or society as a whole can just demand arbitrarily much from you, and you don't really have any right to refuse, because you're not really an individual. Every connection you might have to other people is by default valid. So that was kind of like decoupling of ideas transferred to human beings. And I thought, well, that isn't exactly the difference between right and left, but there's something there at least that has something to do with right and left. So then I added on this other dimension that came from an article by Scott Alexander, or it might not have come from him originally. I suppose people have written about it before, but he called it the thrive-survive theory of the political spectrum, where you'd have a survive end, where people would think of the world and reality as quite harsh and unforgiving, and you need to be quite harsh and unforgiving to people, because people need to be able to pull their own weight. They need to be productive. They need to behave responsibly, or reality will screw them over. So you mustn't be too indulgent to people. And then there's the other one, the thrive end, where we live in a fabulously wealthy society, and we don't have to be stingy toward people who might not be productive for whatever reasons, because they might be weak, or they might be sick, or they might have difficulties in life that makes it hard for them to get good jobs, or whatever. So there's this sort of, we say harsh versus very generous perspective. And if you combine these two axes, the decoupled axis and the thrive-survive axis, I thought that you get pretty good ideas about what left and right is. And the left is the coupled and thrive end, and the right is the survive and decoupled end. and I was quite pleased with that, because what my problem is with the regular political compass is that it has like left and right as the one of the fundamental dimensions, and that bothers me a little bit, because people have been fighting about what left and right actually means for so long that it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't seem like a fundamental thing. It seemed like something that emerges out of other things, and that's what I was trying to go for. And you said it got a little more attention than usual, and yes, it did, because it was the first part of it, first part of two, was linked by Scott Alexander, and I got a lot of views from that, and it's still the one. It still tends to be my most popular page any day, because it gets a lot of flow from search engines, because people search the political compass a lot. So it is absolutely one of my biggest hits, so to speak. And I was a little surprised by that as well, because it isn't particularly new, and I thought it was going to be a short and easy one, and instead it got quite long.
Yeah, well, I think that, again, the reason that may have been so resonant with people, maybe because, again, I think a lot of people don't feel like they have a clear home in what sort of ends up being the mainstream political dialogue, at least in the United States, and at least probably somewhat in Europe, although I think that Europe does a better job of having different parties for different political affiliations, so to speak. So there's probably fewer people in European countries that feel like totally homeless relative to the political dialogue. But, in your model, you have 4 quadrants, and a lot of, political discourse is sort of divided into 2 competing narratives, right? And that there's a lot of people in the two quadrants that aren't necessarily part of whatever the competing mainstream narrative is. And so it makes sense that they would find something like that and be like, oh, this makes me feel like I understand where I belong, right? And so I think that, related to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, we see a lot of political dialogue very, very much focused on contextualization, which makes sense, right? That most people can understand stuff being spoken about in contextualizing terms, that it resonates more with people, that if you are attempting to decouple and everyone else is listening to you as a contextualizer, they don't like you, so it's hard to get elected. All those pieces probably come together to result in a very contextualization heavy political climate. And so people who do tend to, either through disposition or simply through, being part of a Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic society who lean more towards that decoupling side, may experience a little bit of unease with, oh, this is sort of strange that, these two groups are just kind of beating each other up and not understanding each other's arguments seemingly willfully and taking things out of context on purpose or whatever. And if I'm more interested in, abstraction and principles and understanding the other side's points of view and trying to come up with institutions that sort of support strong individualistic behavior and success, then you can just feel left out of the overall political dialogue. So that may be why it was such a resonant thing with people.
Yeah, I guess it was. I don't entirely know. I mean, part of the reason it appeals to me is that it did give me a home quadrant, because on the regular political compass, I am just just on the line between the liberal left and liberal right. So I know I'm not really getting any insight dopamine out of placing myself on it. So I wanted one that was centered on me, and I think a lot of people might have resonated with that.
Yeah, I mean, BuzzFeed made a whole business out of it, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Have you read? Have you read Jonah Peretti's PhD thesis? I don't know if it's a PhD thesis, but some sort of thesis that he wrote.
No.
Fascinating.
No, what's that about?
fascinating. He wrote like a very academic language laden thesis as a college student, just about like identity and how the internet, sort of relates to people's sense of identity and how identity is this like paramount thing for people. And it's, very insightful, very jargon heavy, kind of difficult conceptually. And then he like just goes and makes BuzzFeed and you're like, cool, like good job, man. Nailed that one.
Yeah, I remember. It might not be a big deal today as it was like 10 years ago, but I remember when those tests, like which character in this or that show are you, or which fruit is you, which which tree is most like you, and all that. Yeah, I think that might have blown over, or I'm just not in the same contexts as I used to be. But
they're social media. They're like little. I don't know if it's like something that you can do on Instagram. I've seen it, right? And you push a thing and it spins and it happens. So people post it on their Instagram story now rather than like taking a BuzzFeed quiz. It's still out there. Don't worry.
Yeah. No, people like those tests a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about putting together a post with like survey questions that I've been interested in having answered as well. But it's hard because often most survey questions I'm just irritated by, because like, well, that depends. It's always my answer to everything. So I've been trying to compile a list of questions that I would actually answer, in a very particular way, and not just ask, well, what do you actually mean by that? So that might come out sometime.
And would that be focused on everything, as it were, or
no,
specifically on like political stuff, or what?
No, I'm just whenever I think of some way that I think people differ from each other, I write it down. I have this with just disparate kind of questions, like, do you think most this way or most this way? But I'm not prioritizing that right now, so it will probably take like 5 years.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll start the timer right now.
Yeah.
So John, we've been at it for about an hour and 15 minutes. We touched on, approximately 1.5 of the questions I wrote down, but I think that this was hopefully offered some insight to some of the folks listening. And we'll link to all the posts that we talked about as well, because if anyone listening at this point isn't already following John's blog, I think that would be a thing to prioritize in your internet reading regimen, because the content is fantastic. John, what should people do if they want to learn more? We'll link to the blog. Anything else, any particular posts you think that they should go to?
Oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. It depends on what you're interested in, really.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. Of course, it depends. What am I? Oh, geez, I don't know. I mean,
you have like a start here page on there.
I do, but I haven't updated it in like a year and a half. Maybe I should. Yeah. Maybe I should before this comes out.
The traffic will be off the charts, so you'd better.
Yeah, I mean, the things that people do like to read, it seems, is the political compass pieces, and the Sam Harris Ezra-Klein piece, which is the one who really took off like 2 years ago, and made the blog like 5 to 10 times bigger than it was before. That was a little surprising. And yeah, we haven't even talked about that one, the sort of nerd identity piece I wrote.
Oh yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. We didn't get to that, but that is also one that has been one of my most popular ones, and that's also probably because it makes a lot of people feel validated.
Yeah, totally.
So that's what you're supposed to do if you want to be a big hit. Write something that makes people feel good about themselves, especially in contrast to others.
Nailed it.
Yeah, but I try not to do it though.
It's just so tempting though, right? You're like, all this traffic is just out there to be had. How can I resist?
Yeah. No, I really, when I put up like a dichotomy, like some people think this way and some people think that way, I aim to, put up a dichotomy that the people on both sides would accept as being fair, or that they would find it all right to define themselves as. And I don't know if I exactly did that with the decoupling bit. That's why I'm a little unsure about it. But oh no, I lost my train of thought again. But yeah, I try to do that when I put up dichotomies and things. I like people to be able to identify with both sides. And something that I have actually become quite proud of with the Sam Harris Ezra-Klein piece is that it has been linked, by people who are on both sides of this conflict, people who agree very much with Harris and people who agree very much with Klein. They both people on both sides have linked it approvingly, and that felt pretty good to me.
There you go. The scales of justice are properly balanced.
Yeah. No, but there's just so much polemics out there that we don't need anymore.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddnief.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.